So when a missile strikes a city block, the news cameras, they capture the explosion.
Or all the immediate tragedy, yeah.
Right, exactly. You see that footage on your phone, you process the destruction, and then the news cycle just completely moves on.
Always.
But I mean, what happens on day 3 or day 30? How does a shattered community actually begin the mechanical process of putting the concrete and, well, the people back together?
Which is a huge question.
It is. And as someone who loves to learn and connect the dots, you listening to this are probably pretty used to consuming news about global conflicts. But we almost never stick around for the aftermath. We study the mechanics of destruction, but we completely ignore the blueprints of recovery.
Yeah, and that leaves this massive blind spot in how we understand global events. Because putting a shattered society back together isn't just a logistical matter of pouring new concrete or laying down frayed asphalt.
Right.
It's this highly delicate science of human behavior and urban physics, really.
And that science is basically our mission for today's deep dive. We are unpacking the actual mechanics of how a ruined city gets back on its feet.
Yeah, we are.
And to do this, we're pulling from an audio discussion and a really comprehensive review of a new book. It's called Brutal Catalyst: What Ukraine's Cities Tell Us About Recovery from War by Dr. Russell W. Glynn.
And before we really dive into the data, I think we should establish some parameters here.
Yeah, definitely.
Given that the book centers heavily on the ongoing conflict involving Russia and Ukraine, this is naturally a highly charged landscape.
Very.
So our aim today is not to navigate geopolitical narratives or, take political sides. We are strictly looking at the historical, physical, and social mechanics of urban recovery, just analyzing the blueprints exactly as they are presented in the source material.
Right. We're just looking at the patterns of how humans rebuild.
Yeah.
And there is a specific historical assumption we need to address right out of the gate.
The blank slate.
Exactly. When you think of urban destruction, you usually look at a historical extreme, right? Like Nagasaki in 1945. You have the absolute peak of destructive power resulting in total obliteration.
Yeah.
So the assumption is that an event like that leaves a city with a completely blank slate. You're basically at day 0, which theoretically gives urban planners this unprecedented opportunity to completely redesign a city from the ground up.
Right, and it's a super tempting concept. But I actually have to push back on that because we really need to separate that Nagasaki model from what we're seeing in modern Ukraine.
Okay, how so?
Well, framing the current reality as a generalized blank slate is actually quite misleading. Ukrainian urban areas are not these completely devastated zero-day scenarios, right?
Yeah.
The physical damage across the country as a whole is far less than the generalized destruction we saw in World War II.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, pockets of extreme devastation are the exception rather than the rule.
Okay, wow. That significantly shifts the baseline then. It's not just this flat plane of rubble waiting for a master architect.
Not at all. But, and this is key, those specific pockets of extensive devastation do provide what we might consider a localized blank slate.
Right, like in specific neighborhoods.
Exactly. When the destruction in a specific grid is severe enough, it does provide this unique opportunity. So instead of just an unquestioned return to what was there in, say, 2021, planners can actively improve on the space.
I see. So if you are forced to rebuild an entire city district today, you aren't just replacing what was lost, you can actually engineer it for the future.
Precisely.
Like you can account for the growth of driverless vehicles, which means you suddenly need way less municipal space dedicated to parking lots.
Right, or you factor in the growth of electric vehicles, so you zone for far fewer traditional gas stations. You integrate those advancements directly into the new DNA of the city.
Which is fascinating. But to me, the truly mind-bending part of this is the timing. Because in those World War II examples, the future-oriented planning happened after the treaties were signed.
Right, after the dust settled.
Yeah. But Ukraine is actively addressing this future-oriented recovery while the war is still ongoing. Like, localized repairs during a conflict are standard, but mid-war future-oriented recovery, that's something we just haven't seen historically.
No, we haven't. And to understand how they're even attempting that mid-war recovery, the sources indicate we actually have to look backward first.
Right.
Dr. Glenn takes us into the historical benchmarks of World War II to establish a measurable baseline. He focuses heavily on cities like Tokyo, Manila, Berlin, and Nagasaki.
But why those specific cities, though?
It basically comes down to establishing a statistical control group. By looking at Tokyo and Manila, He's using cities whose populations and urban densities at that time closely mirror the modern Ukrainian cities he studies later.
Oh, I see. It gives planners a mathematical baseline.
Yeah, lets them analyze, how quickly a population of a certain size can process a specific tonnage of rubble or how long it takes to restore baseline food networks.
And the mechanisms of that recovery vary so wildly depending on the political environment. I mean, in Nagasaki, the data shows that recovery was largely a grassroots, bottom-up movement.
Right.
Like, the U.S. military was occupying Japan, but the actual physical recovery, clearing the streets, setting up ad hoc markets, was driven organically by the surviving citizens themselves.
Yeah, and the contrast to that is Berlin, which is basically a masterclass in how top-down bureaucracy stifles recovery.
Because it was divided up, right?
Exactly.
Good.
It was partitioned by 4 different global powers, the U.S., the U.K., France, and the Soviet Union. So you couldn't have a unified grassroots movement because the city was physically and politically fractured.
It's just a logistical nightmare.
Total nightmare.
Okay.
And that fragmentation meant Berlin became incredibly reliant on massive infusions of foreign financial aid just to jumpstart its basic functions. Dr. Glenn points out that when you have a shattered infrastructure flooded with external money and governed by fragmented authority.
Right. Corruption and black markets aren't just likely. They're basically a mathematical certainty.
Yeah.
But, even amidst all that, the black markets in Berlin or the ash of Nagasaki, there is this strange paradox to disaster.
Just silver lining.
Yeah, the sheer necessity of having to rebuild actually forced these cities to install modernized sanitation and healthcare systems that were decades ahead of their pre-war infrastructure. They somehow surpassed what existed before the conflict.
Right. They modernized strictly through necessity.
It's such a fascinating response. I was actually thinking about a popular analogy for this. Visualizing a recovering city as a human body healing from massive trauma,
Right.
Like Berlin is a patient in a coma on life support needing external medicine, while Nagasaki is relying on its own cellular resilience to knit the tissue back together.
Yeah, and honestly, I thought the exact same thing when I first got into this topic.
Mm-hmm.
That urban human body metaphor has been used by people for decades.
It feels really intuitive.
It does, but Dr. Glenn actually spends a lot of time tearing that specific metaphor apart.
Mm.
He recognizes the major flaws in it, and honestly, it falls apart for me too now.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, it's just oversimplifying to the point of being misleading. A biological body is a closed loop, right? But a city isn't.
Okay, yeah.
Cities have multiple brains, not a single central cortex. They are open systems, constantly bringing in and exporting people and goods in a way a human body just can't tolerate. Plus, they rarely actually die, and they evolve in real time.
That makes a lot of sense. So if the human body metaphor fails, what framework does he suggest we use?
Systems theory. Specifically, viewing the urban area as an ecosystem. It's a much more representative analogy.
An ecosystem. Okay, so if we abandon the idea of a single organism, how does viewing a city as this interdependent web change the way we look at recovery?
Well, it forces you to measure all the invisible connections. Every physical structure interacts with the social fabric around it. And to prove why this ecosystem model works better, he transitions to the case of Sarajevo.
Right, in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Yeah. The trauma there wasn't just physical destruction. The central engine of the conflict was deep-seated ethnic hatred.
Right, so you can't just pour fresh concrete over neighbors who fundamentally distrust each other.
Exactly.
The physical infrastructure might be brand new, but if the social ecosystem is toxic, the recovery just completely collapses.
Yeah, consider the logistics of international aid. An organization might come in and build, like, a state-of-the-art power plant. That's a measurable physical success.
Right.
But if they haven't simultaneously helped rebuild a trusted, impartial local police force, that new plant will be stripped of its copper wiring within weeks.
Wow.
The ecosystem just can't sustain the new hardware. And furthermore, actors like Russia specifically use propaganda to inflame these very ethnic conflicts. Cultural cleansing is a massive, deliberate attack on the social web's long-term health.
That is heavy. And recognizing the city as a social ecosystem in the abstract is one thing, but seeing it play out in reality is another. So the sources apply this systems theory framework to 3 Ukrainian cities experiencing entirely different realities right now.
Right. Kharkiv, Kherson, and Mariupol.
And the divergence between these 3 really illustrates the extreme variables planners are dealing with. Like, let's take Kharkiv. It's precariously close to the Russian border, yet its recovery is heavily echoing that Nagasaki data.
The grassroots resilience.
Exactly. The citizens are acting as the engine of their own recovery. They're repairing municipal nodes between strikes rather than waiting for some top-down decree.
Yeah, and then you look at Kherson and you see the total opposite.
Yeah.
You see what happens when an ecosystem's carrying capacity is intentionally poisoned.
The scorched earth retreat.
Right. It wasn't just random destruction. They specifically targeted the foundational systems that keep humans alive.
It's the weaponization of basic survival needs. So what you're saying is we aren't just talking about the lights going out.
No, it's cascading systemic failure.
Right. Like a military planner targets an electrical substation because they know it drops the pressurization in the municipal water grid. And without that water pressure, the sanitation network suffers gridlock in hours.
Sure.
So just by knocking out a power node, they engineer an immediate, localized public health crisis.
They are actively degrading the environment's ability to sustain life. And then, and this is where it gets incredibly complicated, we pivot to Mariupol.
Oh, man, Mariupol.
Yeah, it presents a challenge that international law is currently struggling to even wrap its head around.
The legal complexities there are just staggering. Because it is currently an occupied city, and the occupying administration is actively using the rebuilding process as propaganda.
Right, they're constructing new apartment blocks and public squares as this highly visible projection of legitimacy.
But Ukraine and the international community are simultaneously drafting recovery plans for when Mariupol is eventually liberated.
Which creates a demographic Gordian knot. Because during this occupation, Russian citizens are being brought in to resettle the city.
Right.
So what happens to the legal geography of the city when it's liberated and the original population returns?
I don't even know how an international court arbitrates that. I mean, you have a scenario where a Russian resettler legally acquires an apartment that was built directly over the bulldozed ruins of a Ukrainian home.
Yeah.
When the city is liberated, you're going to have original Ukrainian owners returning with pre-war deeds, standing in the exact same living room as resettlers holding occupation-era deeds.
It's a complete legal nightmare. Because international law protects civilians from forced eviction. But recognizing the occupation-era deeds basically rewards the violent displacement of the original citizens.
That is just, wow.
It requires a deeply considered legal framework. And this introduces a massive thematic element from Dr. Glenn's work, the expectation that Russia will continue to be an existential threat to Ukraine, even during or after any potential ceasefires or peace treaties.
So the threat is basically permanent. And if that's the case, the fundamental architecture of the city has to change, right? How do you build military defense directly into a municipal blueprint without just turning the whole city into a concrete fortress?
You abandon centralization entirely. The solution is distributed infrastructure.
Right, because in a standard city, efficiency dictates centralization. You build one massive power plant for 1 million people because of economies of scale.
Exactly.
But in asymmetrical warfare, that centralized grid is a massive vulnerability. One strike takes the whole grid offline, and you get that cascading failure we just talked about in Kherson.
So you have to rethink the physical layout of the entire ecosystem.
Which really brings us back to that idea of multiple brains, right? Like an octopus.
Yes, perfect analogy.
An octopus has a bundle of neurons in each individual arm, which is basically the blueprint for distributed infrastructure. Instead of one huge power plant, they are engineering dozens of smaller modular power generation units and distributing them throughout the grid.
Right, so every part of the system operates independently, but supports the whole. And mathematically, this completely shifts the balance of power.
Because it's too expensive to destroy.
Exactly. It becomes prohibitively expensive for an adversary to shut down the city. You force the enemy to use a $2 million cruise missile to take out a localized generator that only powers like 3 city blocks.
The cost-to-damage ratio is just completely unsustainable for the aggressor.
Right. And planners are even looking at strategically moving some essential municipal capabilities entirely outside the country's borders to ensure they remain untouchable.
That is brilliant engineering. But, hardening the physical grid is only half of the ecosystem. Repairing the social web after an occupation feels like it would be much harder because you're dealing with mass societal disruption.
Yeah, and Dr. Glenn handles this really precisely. He avoids leaning on vague jargon like collective trauma and focuses instead on the actual concrete challenges of occupation.
Like what specifically?
Well, we're looking at the deliberate brainwashing of populations. He draws direct comparisons to the indoctrination of the Hitler Youth in Germany, for example. Yeah, plus the severe disruption of local communities and the intensely complex gray area of wartime collaboration.
Right. Collaboration is a logistical and moral minefield. Because how does a post-war tribunal vet a collaborator without sparking, like, a vigilante witch hunt?
Exactly.
Think about a local baker in an occupied city who sells bread to occupying soldiers just to secure enough currency to feed his own kids. Is he prosecuted as a traitor?
And this is exactly why the recovery blueprints have to include universally applied, highly transparent vetting standards. Without a really clear framework to distinguish between basic survival actions and ideological collaboration, the ecosystem just descends into retribution.
And the human element of this recovery really requires systemic care. There have to be rigorous psychological standards to safely reintegrate returning soldiers back into the social fabric, too. You can't just hand a returning combatant a hammer and expect them to seamlessly rejoin the civilian workforce.
No, you definitely can't. And to counteract that systemic brainwashing and repair the rewriting of history that happens during an occupation, there's a critical infrastructural node that often gets overlooked.
The cultural resources, specifically libraries and librarians.
Right. Because during an occupation, an aggressor often alters the educational curriculums, bans specific literature, and tries to legally erase the cultural identity of the space.
So in the aftermath, librarians basically function as these analytical nodes of truth. They are the preservers of an unbroken history.
Exactly.
By providing safe, neutral spaces for a fractured community to gather, they help citizens relearn intellectual autonomy. They are just as vital to the social ecosystem as those microgrids are to the physical one.
Yeah, they really are. Which actually leads us to a much broader application of all this analysis.
Right, because if you're listening to this from a peaceful, functioning city, the mechanics of urban recovery in Ukraine might feel a bit distant.
Yeah, but the fundamental reality here is that war is just one kind of disaster.
Exactly. The ecosystem models we're talking about apply universally. I mean, that concept of distributed infrastructure, the octopus model, isn't just a defense against missile strikes.
No, not at all.
It's the exact same blueprint a coastal city needs to survive a Category 5 hurricane that wipes out a centralized power grid.
Or a blueprint for a city facing wildfires that regularly threaten their primary water treatment facilities. The grassroots resilience we saw in Kharkiv, the mathematical necessity of redundant physical systems, the critical nature of social cohesion in Sarajevo, these are universal lessons.
They really are. They're mechanisms of survival for any urban area suffering catastrophe, whether it's earthquakes, fires, or hurricanes.
Yeah.
And I think that underscores the core takeaway of this deep dive. Citizens have to be fundamentally integrated into the decision-making process.
Absolutely.
You cannot mandate a successful recovery from a pristine office thousands of miles away. The people who lived through the disaster, who understand the specific nuances of their local ecosystem, they have to be the primary architects of their own future.
Because if you try to enforce a top-down recovery without local ownership, the new structures, whether that's a physical building or a newly installed local government, they'll lack fundamental legitimacy. And without legitimacy, the ecosystem will eventually just reject them.
Yeah, it's inevitable. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the blueprints of recovery, I want to leave you with a specific concept to chew on. We've mapped out historical baselines, ecosystem theory, and distributed infrastructure. Now I want you to apply that lens to your own environment.
Yeah, take a close look at your own city today. If your urban ecosystem suffered a catastrophic failure and had to be rebuilt from scratch tomorrow, and I don't just mean the physical roads and bridges, but the complex social web what's, hidden ethnic tensions, systemic economic flaws, or deep community divisions would suddenly become your biggest hurdles to recovery.
It really changes the way you look at the streets you walk down every day. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep looking past the obvious narratives, and keep exploring.